Welcome to Honoring Indigenous Voices. My name is Sylvia Morales, and I am the Executive Director for the Resource Center for Nonviolence. I want to thank everyone at Friends of Uristac, the Amamutsan Tribal Band, the Amamutsan Land Trust, and the UCSC Critical Missions Project for their hard work and dedication to collaborate on this event. I want to give a special appreciation to our RCNV staff, Amanda, doing tech, Tom, and the RCNV Board of Directors, Eileen Feynman, Peter Klotz-Chamberlain, Joe Williams, and I don't know, Casey Kasich, Leslie Potenzo. Thank you. I'd like to thank Liza for her persistence in organizing this event. Where's Liza? There she is back there. I want to thank Benny and Dora, if they're in the room, and all of the Friends of Uristac volunteers. I especially want to thank Joseph Schultz for cooking us a beautiful meal. And finally, I want to thank Community Television for providing us the technology support, making it possible to live stream this event, and also I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to give a special recognition to Sandy Brown. I know she's here in the room. And I thought I would open with a meditation to help us get grounded and help settle our energy a little bit. I know it's been rainy, and some of you must have driven from far away. So the opening meditation, it's something that I've written recently, and it's our meditation on building beloved community. So if you don't mind grounding your feet on the ground, maybe lowering your gaze, and I'll take this moment to read this meditation out to you. Allow your awareness of this present moment to fuel a deeper connection to an open heart and receptive mind, connecting with your body's wisdom. Within this space, take a moment to treasure and respect the beauty of the natural world that surrounds you, remembering that you are one with the earth. Take in some breaths and rest into this knowing and into your body. Reflect on the past and imagine a future where all beings will be safe, free, healthy, respected, and bonded to the earth we all share. Imagine cultivating care for the earth and yourself that will naturally emanate to others. Imagine expressing care and respect for the earth and others in words, actions, art, ritual, listening, and by coming together to build beloved community. This beautiful meditation was inspired by Christine Evans, a beautiful, gentle, and generous soul. Thank you. And now I would like to move into our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the ceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yubi tribe. We acknowledge that the 3 waves of violent colonization of this land, the mission period, the Mexican period, and the American period. We acknowledge that violent colonization continues today with projects that could destroy sacred sites and burials, and laws that limit indigenous rights. This land and water is stewarded by the Amamutsan Tribal Band, the descendants of those taken to Mission, Santa Cruz, and San Juan Bautista. This is the land of the tallest of trees, the everlasting coast redwood, the endangered steelhead fish, harbor seals, and nourishing coastal fog. Thank you. And now we're going to move into a welcome by Chairman Lopez.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Valentin Lopez, and I'm the chairman of the Ama Mutsun Tribal Band. I want to remind people or let people know that the lands that you are on are the lands of the Uipi tribe. The Uipi tribe lived here for thousands and thousands of years. One of the oldest known sites, cultural sites, in California is at Scotts Valley, and that site is 13,200 years old. And that's how long our people have lived here, and much longer than that. What we ask people to do today is to work on healing yourself and learning the truth about that history. What we ask is them to also work to help support the Native people, help them bring back their culture, help them bring back their language, their spirituality, to have access to their sacred and cultural sites so they can restore their prayers, restore their healing. We must all work together. This is something we can work together on healing Mother Earth and getting the fresh water to return, getting the salmon to return. That is what we need to do. That is the work that is before us. By your attending the session today, that path is started, and we welcome you. Let's work hand in hand. Let's heal together.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Lopez. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a great turnout. I know it was like braving the weather in the last 12 hours, wasn't it? For those in the area, that was a crazy event last night. My name is Greg Cotton, and I'm one of the founding members of Friends of Huristock. We are a non-Indigenous solidarity group, a public group, which you all are welcome to join and be involved with. We support the Ama Mutsun tribal band's leadership to protect their most sacred land, this land from development. And there's an open pit sand and gravel mine in Huristock, their sacred land, which lies between Watsonville and Gilroy. So the Friends of Huristock are really for Indigenous solidarity to protect and to support the tribe to protect their sacred site and to return stewardship, traditional stewardship to this land. Friends of Huristock, for me, when Chairman Lopez often says that we all have healing to do, the tribe has healing to do, people who live on Indigenous land have healing to do. I'm often wondering, like, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for me? What do those steps take? For me, being part of Friends of Huristock is so central to my healing process and for our community's healing process to stop our laws and our cultural structures that allow for the degradation and the destruction of sacred lands and burial sites like that. So to engage in that resolution of those issues is really healing for me. And we don't take your trust lightly. And we just really thank you and really honor our relationship to do this work together and to support you in that. Thank you. So this event was inspired by Chairman Lopez's wisdom. We invite you to be here with an open heart, to listen to the speakers, and to explore what healing means for you and for our community at large. So for some of you, when it came in, you got a note card. One of the ways that we're inviting you to participate today is to write your questions. If you have questions down for the speakers, to write them on your card. And we've got Liz and Dora at the back, and you can pass your questions to the end, or if you need a card, if you did not get a card and want one, please raise your hand, or if you need a pen, We're inviting people, and if you don't have to use it, but it's there, right? And we're going to continue as the day unfolds to engage with these cards as a way to stay in communication in this venue. And if you have like inspirations to share, right? If it's not just a question, you're like, oh, this was really great, and you want a communication to go back to either the speakers or the group, that's another way to do that. So with that, it's an honor to introduce Carolyn Rodriguez. Carolyn Rodriguez is an Indigenous scholar and member of the Amamutsun tribal band. She is a first-generation college student who obtained a bachelor's degree in modern literature from UCSC in 2012. In 2021, she received her master's from UCLA in American Indian Studies. Carolyn now attends the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and Social Research Methodology program. Her research highlights the importance of humanizing tribal university relationships, Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge systems, and community-based, culturally relevant pedagogy and curriculum. Please welcome to the stage Carolyn Rodriguez.
Okay, I'm gonna probably have to move this. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about healing for me looks like storytelling. So I'm going to be talking about reclaiming and restoring truth through storytelling by sharing some of my experiences engaging with Amamutsun history, education, and activism. And I gotta make sure I get my groove here. Wait. Is this on? Oh, okay. Right when I look away. Okay. Thank you for introducing me, Greg, and everything. I'm going to be sharing some of my work being at UCLA within my master's program with American Indian Studies, and also sharing my current work within my dissertation. Am I pointing it the right way? Okay, sorry, I'm like, oh, okay, I think this is the spot, okay. An overview, basically I'm just gonna give some background info on the tribe, talking about our relationships with the land and how, colonization has impacted that, focusing on storytelling, education, and cultural relearning, and I'm gonna talk about some research engagement that the community's been doing that I'm involved in, and then ending with some more information on protecting Uristock, our sacred site. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Oh. Okay, gonna get this figured out. Okay, so the tribe, just for background info, our tribal lands encompass what we know today, like the counties of San Benito, Monterey, Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, and San Mateo. And so our ancestors were enslaved at Mission San Juan Bautista in Santa Cruz. And so because of the horrible conditions there, our today's tribal band, we represent the surviving descendants of 20 villages that lived in the area that inhabited the mountains, the valleys, the coastline, pretty much from the greater Monterey Bay area for thousands of years. And so they were connected by the shared cultural knowledge, traditions, and our relationships with the land and our more than human relatives, and also by speaking the Mutsun language. And so today we're definitely growing with over 600 members to date. We are working towards upholding our tribal sovereignty as a non-federally recognized tribe. So there's several impacts of colonization, but what I really want to focus on is Indigenous peoples, California natives, their relationship to land. And so, being on the land, we had a reciprocal relationship where we cared for the land. And so when our ancestors were removed from the land, that's when they, there was a ripple effect. And so, not only could you say there was a genocide of California natives, you could also say that there impacts California native plants and how there a lot of plants have gone extinct. And so there's been issues with just like for us not being able to, have cultural burning and harvesting, tilling, and like pruning and sowing the land. And so, like we see, because of that, we see larger impacts that relate to climate change today. And so so basically, like, when my, sorry, I'm like, I don't, oh my God, it's going too fast. I think I clicked it again. Okay, sorry. So what I want to focus on and point out is how, these sites, these cultural sites, Indigenous people connected with, and also how Chairman Lopez, he talked about the Yupik people and also the Waswas. And so like today, we don't see an Waswas tribal nation, but that doesn't mean that there's not a Waswas descendants. And so part of our journey is, learning our history, but learning the relationships with land. And so being here in Santa Cruz, like working in the Santa Cruz Mountains, like, we're reconnecting with the land, but also the land is healing. And so I feel that, pretty soon, like with continued conversations, continued research, I do hope that we will be able to identify Waswas descendants and help strengthen their connection to the land and bring them back to the area. So I just wanted to say how important relationships are and how, we're able, as Amamutsan people, we're able to honor the land and, do the work for Waswas people, and as they can, as we continue the journey of healing and learning, and we make those connections. And so that goes back to climate change and how this work is also impacting the land. And here, for example, we have a lot of archaeological sites that we can learn from, like a lot of cultural sites, and they could be impacted by the high sea level rise, or even we saw catastrophic fires in Santa Cruz a few years ago. And so there's just, not only are we relearning our history and, getting that knowledge and reconnecting with it, but at the same time, we have to think about climate change and the land and how our work is, looking at this larger issue. And so, yeah, so kind of switching over to talk more on learning our future. I'm sorry, learning our history to talk about Amamutsan futures. Oh my goodness. So one of the projects that I'm currently on, and I've been working with, it's through the Critical Mission Studies grant. Okay, yeah, there's this more info. But I've had the opportunity to work with, like through the Amamutsan Land Trust, working with Rob Cutherall and Alexi Sagona, who we'll hear from next, but really coming together to talk about the history of the California missions and how there's this conventional versus critical mission history, how, for example, there's this myth that the missions they civilized and they brought, they civilized the natives and brought them good, like made their life better and brought them religion, but with completely disregarding the native spirituality and the culture that has already been existing for thousands of years. And so we also looked at, how to tell this critical history that goes against these myths. And we looked at scholars. For example, we engaged with Elias Castillo's work, Across of Thorns, and so looking at what scholars and what the archives and historians are saying about, what actually took place in the mission system. And so if we learned that, the missions were an institution for genocide, and it was also a place for the Spanish Empire for their economic growth. And so our goal was to create booklets about the true history from the Amamutsan perspective, to honor Indigenous voices, but to also explain from our perspective what happened at Mission San Juan Bautista and also Mission Santa Cruz. And so part of the project is looking through our Harrington notes, which, there it goes. And so for background info, John P. Harrington was this Smithsonian anthropologist that worked, along the coast, and he worked with Amamutsan people, collecting information and writing down stories. And to point out and to highlight, he really worked with Ascension Soloronzo, and also like a few of our other, I think it was like my cousin or her daughter, but there's other family members that worked with John P. Harrington to document, document Ascension's stories, so that way, because she's like the one back, that knew she needed to share the knowledge with him. So then that way we could document our history about our culture, our language, traditions, medicine, to talk about basically, so that way today we can reconnect with the knowledge. And so those notes, there's been past work with the tribe and Land Trust working with UC Berkeley and Rob Catherall to go through to go through the transcriptions and to digitize them, so that way we can also make sure that this information reaches the community and it's not just stuck in the archives at UC Berkeley. And so making sure, so feel like the project is to make sure that we educate our own community, but that we're also educating the public on the history from the Amamutsan perspective. And so here's just some more goals on the project. I think I kind of just said this already, but basically, we want to bring back our knowledge. We want to take control of our history and our representation of ourselves, and we want to break the cycle of this one-sided history of colonial history that completely disregards our voice. And so, okay, I'm like, it worked on time. So, part of what I do is looking at storytelling in history and how we can do that in education research. And so this is just what I've done with my master's thesis at UCLA. I did, rewriting California Native American representations, Amamutsan sovereignty and educational experiences of tribal elders. So I looked at some archives and some, literature on basically what has been written about California natives and how it's very stereotypical, a lot of misrepresentations, and for example, in newspapers, when California was becoming a state, natives in the San Francisco Chronicle, they would say that California natives were the devil or savages. And so I looked at how those type of stereotypes, how they are still present today, especially in education, and how they impact California Native students. And so I also, from me having that educational background, I then wanted to speak to our elders and hear about their educational experiences. And so this is where I am able to use, storytelling and oral history in my interviews, so that way, so I can learn from them. And the whole point was that I wanted to make sure that I'm honoring Indigenous voices in my research and I'm telling their stories accurately. And so just some background info, I just will share that, from storytelling, I was able to learn that elders, they experience poverty, discrimination, and they feel like they were poorly educated and they didn't have the resources that they need to go to college. If they did go to college, they struggled with balancing academics, having a full-time employment, being a full-time student, and they also recognized that they did not connect with the Amamutsan culture growing up, and so they're doing a lot of learning about our knowledge and about our history as an adult. And so part of my thesis was about, how can we combat misrepresentations, but then honor our stories, and so that way also thinking about the future. And so the elders are dreaming about a future where Amamutsan youth grow up learning about their culture and where they're able to have a strong identity. And I do have a quote that I want to share. You can't really see it, but oops, sorry. Well, so these are some so this is how I combat misrepresentations, by highlighting California natives authors. And so this is just me acknowledging that, I looked at Deborah Miranda's work with Bad Indian, also Greg Saris with Mabel McKay's story. And so all of them is they're, telling their histories from the from their cultural perspective. Sorry, I'm trying to go back to my slide. Okay, and so, so part of this rewriting and talking about like Amo Mutsun, the elder, she says, the Western world is successful and we could be successful with it, but long as we know who we are. Because if you don't know where you come from, if you don't know who you are, I feel you're always going to be lost because you're in a world that wasn't meant to be. We weren't meant to be in a Western world. We were meant to be in our own native lands and our own cultural and everything else, but it's just the way things happened. We have to be stronger, being a minority, being Amo Mutsun. We have to be stronger and learn as much as knowledge to be one step ahead. Like I said, the law was created not to benefit us. I think the law was to benefit colonialism, but we can learn the law because the books are there for anybody to read and learn and succeed. Anybody can be successful with an education or without an education. Sorry, I don't know. Will it go? Can you do that? Are you? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everybody. I think. Can we just go back one slide then? Okay. Well, so the quote that I shared from the elder was basically to just show again, like the dreams that we have for the future and our struggle with learning our history, learning about our culture, and having that in our daily lives. And so I was really looking at how can we rewrite the script, like rewrite these stereotypes, but also honor, so I was like trying to honor all California natives. And so that's why I was engaging with this literature and using this literature as positive representations of California natives. And the last thing I have on is a quote from John P. Harrington. And so this is from a poem that a poem that is transcribed or inscribed on Ascension, one of our relatives, which I will get into her. Wait, I'm so sorry. I know, right? I get that feedback all the time. Okay. So basically just trying to show that Ascension, that her history is important, that we're engaging with her stories, and that this poem right here was just from John P. Harrington writing about how powerful she was. And so if you do go to her gravesite, you're able, you can read the full poem, but I just had this here to basically show how powerful this woman is and how, from her example, this is how we're doing a lot of our relearning and reconnecting with our culture. So yeah, that was what I was trying to say. I apologize again for all the slides, but we should have smooth sailing from here on out. So switching gears a little now, if I can go to the next slide. I'm going to focus on, again, more research with our cultural revitalization. The next slide, please. Oh, yes, thank you. So this is more of my current work. I look at tribal university relationships and how the Amo Mutsun Land Trust is collaborating with UCLA. It's specifically the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science. It's a nonprofit at UCLA housed in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. And there's just been research to talk about water stewardship and to blend, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge with Western science. And specifically, we're looking at environmental DNA of a specific creek here up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. There was a dam there. It's like Davenport. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the area, but there was a dam that was removed. And so that creek, we look at the water health before and after the dam. And a part of that creek was a major life source for salmon migration. And so with the dam, that got in the way of salmon trying to make it up in order to reproduce. And so, looking at how we're revitalizing our relationships with water, coming into the project, I was analyzing how the university can support healthy relationships and healthy research with tribal communities. And a part of that is now taking a step forward in all that research and all this knowledge that we've gained, putting that into curriculum. So then that way we can then start teaching youth about our culture so they can learn more about water stewardship, but salmon migration, And a part of this is also reconnecting with our ceremonies and bringing back our songs and dances, since, we are able to come together, have a ceremony, and, have good intentions and set our prayers for the salmon, for a healthy salmon run for the upcoming year. And so youth are able to learn about their culture, learn about, health of water, which then impacts climate change, but they're also, strengthening their own cultural identity. And so I feel like with my dissertation, I really look at how tribal universities, specifically UCLA, how they can support the community and support with community-based curriculum, so that way the community is creating our own lesson plans, our own knowledge. It would be almost and culturally relevant, where we can teach youth through storytelling and reconnecting them through the land. And the next slide, please. And so the Land Trust, we have a yearly summer camp, and so the goal is to have this curriculum, to teach it at the camp. At the camp, this is where youth can go out for about 2 weeks. It's like during July, August, and so it's up here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And they, they just learn about the land, and we took them out to the beach. They learned about seaweed. We took them out to another sacred site, Mount Eminem, to learn about our creation stories. And so by connecting with land and by hearing stories, this is how they're able to reconnect with our culture, and how we're ensuring that our culture is being taught to the next generation. And so, so that's like what I'm working on right now, is like, how do I get these stories to our youth, and thinking about the future. And a part of that, looking at environmental justice, is teaching them about sacred sites, but also we're teaching them about activism. And so our next slide, we talked about the campaign for Protect Your Stock, and so that fits under Indigenous environmental justice, since it's a reaction to the structure of settler colonialism that continues through times, and that threatens Amamut's and sacred lands. And so, for example, we don't have land right, we don't own the land. So for Eurostock or like these other sites that we're connecting to, we have to gain access in some way. And so can I get the next slide? So Eurostock it's a very powerful place for our people. And that's where we had our annual Big Head ceremonies. And so it was a very sacred place for our community to come together. And it had a lot of cultural knowledge, but also, it was a place for so many ecosystems. And right now, there's a permit for a sand and gravel mining permit on the mountain. And so, like, if that is to take place, then sand and the gravel, the sand and the gravel mining would desecrate the grasslands and the oak woodland habitats. And so the Amamutsan, we're trying to learn about our history, honor our Indigenous voices and our ancestors, but it's hard to bring back our ceremonies when we're not able to connect with the lands of where this, because the ceremony has to take place at a certain area. So so that's why our connection to the land is so important. And so if Eurostock takes place, then it would be huge extraction, not only for the land, but also for our culture. And the next slide, they're talking more about Eurostock. It's in the Gilroy area. Here's a map here kind of showing where they would dig out the mountain and where they would basically destroy Eurostock. And so we've been opposing this mine since it came out. And the next slide, please. It shows what's at stake. So the sacred site, it can't be moved. Once we can't be relocated. Once it's gone, and we're not able to reconnect with it. And so it really gets in the way of our tribal community, who envisions a future where youth and their future generations, where they can have these ceremonies at this site. And so, and again, all of this is supposed to be a part of our healing, but it's also a reaction again to colonialism, where the land is not seen as a cultural site, it's seen as a profit. And so that's why our activism is so necessary, and why we're needing to teach youth about activism. And so our next slide, it just shows 2 examples of 2 walks. So it's September the 8th, 2019. we had a walk from Mission San Juan Bautista to the outer areas of Uristoc, and there was about 100 tribal members that came, but about 300 community members, so there was about 400 of us walking together. And so from us, it was this form of healing for our ancestors because, you know, they had to leave the mountain and leave other sites to go to San Juan Bautista, but for this, it represented us moving away from that history and coming towards learning about our history from our cultural sites. And that was before COVID. We wanted to have more walks, but of course COVID happened. And so the youth, we came together. It's a few of us, also like older adults that lead the younger groups of kids. And so on October 24th, 2020, the youth, we all came together to continue, you know, continue speaking out against the mining permit, but also to carry our prayers for our elders and for those that couldn't walk, especially because social distancing was so important. And so we were trying to find a way to still connect and still heal and still stand up for Uristoc, even though it was COVID and social distancing. And on the next slide, I have a photo of us. And I think I also want to point out that we have our dancers and our singers, I'm sorry, they're in their regalia. And so we started the walk, the youth walk, with singing and with ceremony. Well, it wasn't an official ceremony, but it was like, you know, bringing in that sacredness of singing and setting our prayers and setting our intentions for protecting Uristoc. And so a part of so like I said, we're teaching them activism, but we're also, you know, using it as an opportunity to teach them about Uristoc. So there has been Uristoc curriculum that you can find online it's for the community, but it's also for the public. And like the youth are just learning about what happens to these, you know, 248 acres if the mining permit is approved. And of course, there's also federally listed threatened animals or species like the tiger salamander and the California red-legged frog. And so like so they're also talking about their worries and connections with these species. And so again, they're, you know, speaking out, they're learning about they're speaking out as activists, but at the same time, they're learning about their cultural identity. And so I can just get the next slide. So here's another photo of Uristoc. But I think just to say that a part of the story that I shared today is just talking about the different work that we're doing to tell our history, to teach our history to the public, but really how can we learn it within our own community, thinking about the youth, strengthening their identities, and how a part of that, again, is protecting land and protecting Uristoc. And there's a lot of friends here of Uristoc, and you all might have, so there might be a lot of people that know about the movement. But, you know, for example, last year we had a rally, and so, you know, there was a women's singing group, and a lot of youth came out to sing, and that was, to give more background, that was during the environmental impact report, when the report came out about what would happen if the mining permit would take place. And so we were there to talk to, you know, basically to encourage people to read the report and get invested, not only because it's protecting our culture, but also because it's protecting Mother Earth and protecting the sites that the locals here in the area would be impacted by. So this isn't just protecting our history and our connections to the land, it's also protecting the land for everybody today that lives in the area. And so just keep Uristoc, we gotta keep talking about Uristoc, keep fighting for Uristoc, because we're waiting for those comments to be reviewed. We're still waiting to hear the final outcome. But for now, that's just where we're at, trying to strengthen our identity, learn our culture in the midst of everything that's going on. And so thank you so much for listening. And yeah.
Thank you for that. That's a lot of great words to think about and movements. Appreciate that. And just a reminder, there's, you know, the cards as you hear the speakers speaking, right? They probably naturally would have questions arrive or thoughts arise. And we just, again, encourage people to write them down. If you need a note card, please raise your hand. And we'll, after our next speaker, we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll kind of collate those questions and give them a time to answer those questions. Our next speaker is Alexi Sagona. Alexi is a fifth-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, where he studies indigenous environmental governance. Using ethnographic methods, his research investigates how the Amamutsun tribal band enacts their cultural obligation to steward ancestral landscapes, despite limitations as a non-federally recognized tribal community. He serves as chair of the Amamutsun Land Trust Lands Committee, is involved with the Amamutsun-led Protect Huristock campaign, and is an advisory board member for Green Foothills. Please welcome Alexi Sagona.
Mishmin Arua, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's not always easy to show up on a Saturday morning, and a lot of us have to pay the bills and do a lot of work, and so there's not that much free time in this world right now, and so I appreciate you committing to being here in this space. On reflecting on this, I feel like a lot of the words that I'm gonna say are trying to encapsulate a feeling, an emotion, a relationship in a foreign colonial language that doesn't maybe do it justice. And so I guess what I can think about in being here today, what's truly important is just us sharing a meal together, being together in this place, right? Words can only go so far. So I just really want to commend you all, and I'm also looking forward to sharing a meal. And I'm going to be attempting to use the English language to show y'all something that I really care about, but it might not get to the point, so to say. And I'll also say that right now my heart is, suffering with seeing a lot of the senseless violence that's happening in the Middle East. And I'm really just keeping my mind and intentions open for a ceasefire right now. And also just, thank you. Yeah. And thinking about how, today, as an Indigenous person with no expertise on, that site, that context, but someone who really is looking at Indigenous issues in Central California, how that can maybe support the broader effort of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And I think I want to just think through that with y'all. I don't have much to say there. I'm not an expert, but hopefully we can kind of reflect on that. And yeah, by way of positionality, I'm a tribal member. I got involved with the community when I was about 18, 19. Grew up in the Bay Area, but didn't know much about my identity. I have ancestry from Micronesia, Southeast Asia, Southern Europe, all these other places as well. So mixed, like many of us maybe. And so this journey to reconnect with my culture has been a lot through reading in graduate school and also on the land with my community. Carolyn talked a little bit about Native stewardship, and for myself, that has meant so much for my journey. So I am not gonna touch this if I don't have to. I don't wanna touch the clicker. So I might just ask y'all to go to the next slide if that's okay. Would that be okay? Thank you so much. So let's move on to the next slide. So just a way of outline, I wanna chat with y'all about sort of some tribal perspectives of land and a little bit of background of where I'm coming from and how I'm approaching my research. Also, side note, I'm a fifth-year PhD student, like really in the weeds with some things right now, and I use technical language on accident, and so, at lunch, maybe we can have a conversation if I'm confusing, and I just apologize for that. Right now, my headspace is a bit narrow, so to say. I'll be talking a little bit about mechanisms for access, and then a little bit of work with the Lands Committee and the Protect Huristock campaign. And then finally, just a slide about the ways to support Amamutsun, in addition to what Carolyn already said. Next slide, please. So just by way of background, right, since 2006, the Amamutsun have invested in kind of returning to ancestral lands through tending practices, right? Amamutsun people have always been here, But in 2006 was sort of a moment when the tribal community was invited by Pinnacle's National Monument at that time, now Pinnacle's National Park, to be involved in some of the restoration practices. And that involved, a vulnerability of saying we have a lot of dormant knowledge, but we'll relearn this and restore our connection to this place because we are the indigenous peoples of the area. And since then, back please, thank you. Since then, the tribe has really grown that and created different tools and pathways to be involved in land stewardship, creating the Amamutsun Land Trust a few years after this, and then, getting different easements and access agreements, which I'll be talking about a little later on. Has anyone read Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer? Oh. I'll admit I haven't read it back to back. I've read some chapters though, but just Robin Wall Kimmerer writes some amazing articles, and one of them talks about this idea of reciprocal restoration, which is the mutual reinforcing restoration of land and culture, right? You take care of the land will take care of you. And I think this is really central to what the Amamutsun are doing to try to revitalize culture, right? This idea of we are a place-based culture. If we invest in relationships with land and really cultivate those relationships, our culture will become revitalized and the land will be restored. Restored is something that is very, politically fraught sometimes and contentious, but restoring relationships is something that contemporary communities can always do with land, right? Not necessarily restoring it to 1769 before the Portola expedition came to Central California or anything like that. Next slide, please. So Carolyn touched on this already, but this is sort of just a little bit about the community, the missions that we survived through, and the land trust, which employs Native stewards. Next slide, please. And this is some photos of the wonderful Native Stewardship Corps members. On the top is a youth internship program and tribal steward program too, so it's like a big group of us. That day we had just taken out some hemlock from Quiroste Valley Cultural Preserve. And then below this is Chris Ott, and he's a tribal member who was being involved in a pile burn. So I love these photos. These are the tribal members, and it's really sort of the heart of this reciprocal restoration, right? This program. These are the people that are doing that reciprocal restoration. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you all some wonderful quotes of tribal members because I think that's really important, right? There are many folks who live in like Las Vegas, Washington, things like that, it's not easy for them to come out here on a Saturday to talk, but I really think it's important that their voices be heard. So one tribal member and land steward talked about, how, I'll just read it. I know that our tribe has been active members of the landscape. Everyone is connected to the land. You just have to allow yourself to feel that relationship and realize that all living things are connected to us, where we're equally related. When we realize that we're taking care of our relatives. So this person, I think, is a steward who's describing that moment, right, of, no, I'm not a manager. I'm not this top-down person that, maybe the anthropocentric worldview that many of us have, where like we think we're the center of everything. And so I think that is what's really important about the Native Stewardship Corps, this quote. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another tribal elder, I had a conversation with for some of my interviews for my research project, talked about how it's important to learn the indigenous ways for survival. He says, we were taught the natural food, we had to know which mushrooms to get, what time of year is best to be hunting, how to build a fire. What makes me so proud now is that we're doing things in the indigenous way, and in doing that, we will survive any catastrophe. I think that's really poignant. It also makes me think about how a lot of us are seeing climate change, right, and the catastrophes that are maybe looming or already happening. And this tribal elder just reminds me that the indigenous knowledge can help survive catastrophes. There's a indigenous philosopher, Kyle White, who Stan has talked to extensively, and Dr. White talks about how indigenous peoples in the US have survived catastrophes already and are sort of fully prepared. And I see that, and I'm reminded of that in this quote here with Robert Trujillo. Next slide, please. Chairman Lopez has so many great quotable moments, but one thing here is talking about the most important thing of all restorations, that you restore spirituality. To restore spirituality to the land and to the people, the rivers and the ocean, the fish, the birds. We need to restore the spirituality for all. Right, so indigenous peoples as caretakers, Chairman Lopez talks about how we have a cultural obligation from Creator to take care of Mother Earth, but also restoring the spirituality, I think, is another important thing. And so that means that when you're talking about stewardship, it's not maybe just always active tending where you can see the impacts physically. It can be ceremony, it can be offering prayers, it can be speaking the Mutsun language to these non-human relatives, things like that. That is all part of stewardship, right? The spiritual component of it. Next slide, please. So a lot of my research is thinking about supporting tribal access. And I will say with a caveat that I'm currently doing a bigger project right now for my dissertation where I'm on like interview 40 right now, hoping to do a few more, and I haven't wrapped up. So I can't, and I really wish I could, but I can't give y'all a lot of the information of that because it's still in the process. There's something called free, prior, and informed consent, about protocols for research that I need to go back to tribal community members, give them feedback. It's a process. So bear with me. I apologize. I hope in the future I can give y'all a bit more of these wonderful quotes. But I'll be talking about access and then what that means. For me, it's about supporting basically the ability to have reciprocal restoration in place. So it's not just physical access to a park trail. Some of us, if we think about access, that's what we immediately think, because that's how access is used a lot. But there's some scholars who talk about the theory of access as being the ability to benefit from things. So this might be talking about indigenous governance systems, maybe when tribes want to burn, and that could be outside of the burn windows of today. That could be inhibiting access. Maybe access means the ability to have ceremony. Maybe access means the ability to speak our language and use those other modes of governance. And I think oftentimes tribal access may have to confront Western laws and regulations. I mean, one example is, for the tribe to benefit from things and to be in a good relationship with place, it has to be about how, we don't own the land, right? We belong to it. And so sometimes that means Amamutsun Land Trust has to get property rights to a place. But that sort of relationship of owning something, of having that land tenure system, actually might inhibit your ability to see something as your relative. If you're just thinking about the regulations and how you own something and how you manage it, you can really get in that mindset, and that can be very damaging. Next slide, please. So some barriers to access, and I just talked about a couple, but one, Carolyn mentioned federal recognition. That's a big barrier, right, to accessing land. And then also displacement. So it takes several hours for tribal members to get to ancestral places. Many tribal members live in the Central Valley, 3 hours away or so. Dormant tribal knowledge can be really difficult, right? It's tough sometimes when you don't know the language, right? The Mutsun language or the philosophy behind why things are named certain things, and you have to use the English language, which is so limiting in ways. And then also, in thinking about the Native Stewardship Corps, this was really created in 2018. But when we're thinking about traditional ecological knowledge, this is built over generations and generations. So I feel like sometimes, and this is a personal opinion, is that there's sort of we're in a time of great change, we need indigenous knowledge right now, but this sort of knowledge system, which is so resilient, which can, as Robert Trujillo said, survive any catastrophe, might take several generations to come. And so the ability to sort of maintain that and cultivate that is quite difficult. And there may not be, revitalized traditional knowledge that happens within a couple decades. It's going to take generations. Next slide, please. So a professor and advisor of mine at the University of San Francisco, where I did my undergraduate degree, Dr. Adrian Johnson and I, we're looking at access for Amamutsun, and specifically we're looking at different tools and mechanisms for access. And right now we're writing a paper about this, so this is what I'll be kind of talking about for the next portion of this presentation. So next slide, please. So we're looking at MOUs, and bear with me now, I know this can be kind of boring, I hope you all don't glaze over, but Memorandum of Understanding. This is basically a non-binding, formalized handshake agreement that's used in so many different things. In this context, I'm talking about MOUs that help facilitate land access for Amamutsun. So MOUs with basically agencies or land trusts who have land. And so we did an interview project where we talked with 14 folks, some of these places here, and also tribal members. And next slide, please. And so, what we found, is that the tribe has talked about how Creator doesn't tell us that we own the land. And so this pathway of let's get in a relationship with folks that can provide access to the land has been one mechanism and strategy for the tribe. Also, some folks have described it as more like low-hanging fruit. If you're trying to go for land back in certain ways, an MOU might be an easier way to facilitate the beginning of reconnecting to this place, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. So this is a definition. I think why it's so relevant right now is that they're endorsed by Governor Newsom as a tool for co-management. Co-management basically just means some degree of power sharing, right, between often like an agency or a nonprofit organization and, in this case, a tribe. So yeah, co-management is something broad, but an MOU is a sign of co-management, that there's multiple parties in a relationship to help manage a place. And there's also a California State Parks Tribal MOU program. The Amamutsun Tribal Band was the first tribe that was non-federally recognized to get an MOU with state parks a few years back. And so, yeah, basically it's a nascent tool for securing access, especially here in California, that we found really interesting. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here are some benefits and limitations for y'all to think about. And keep in mind here, right, this is all about restoring reciprocal restoration, right, restoring that connection to place and culture. And this is one pathway towards that. So it can help in our interviews, basically, this is kind of what we've found so far, is it helps evolve relationships and build trust. It's well known and it's used a lot by agencies like parks, National Park Service. It's very flexible. And we also found that it's very relational. So what Chairman Lopez described was the Amamutsun secured an MOU at Pinnacles National Monument. Tribal Chair Lopez then went to other agencies like Bureau of Land Management and said, hey, we have this MOU here. And then Bureau of Land Management, state parks are like, oh, these are other agencies, we can follow these templates. And that's sort of how the tribe has gotten into more MOUs, right? So when one agency sees that, oh, this group has an agreement, there's precedent, it really opens the door in other ways. However, some limitations are, it's still paternalistic. At any time, an agency can abrogate their responsibilities. This is non-binding, right? Non-legally binding. So that's also sort of precarious. There's also limited tribal member knowledge of the MOUs. So on paper, there can be a lot of things that are said about tribal harvesting rights, but if it doesn't actually get to the community members, it isn't actually utilized. And so that could be a big limitation, right? Not everyone's gonna be reading these 10-page, very technical, jargony agreements. And then there's also a fear of favoritism of different tribes. However, with MOUs, presumably a group like Parks could have MOUs with several local tribes, and that shouldn't be a big issue. But some agency folks expressed a bit of fear of working with multiple tribes and sort of playing favorites if they give an MOU to one tribe, so to say. And then also there's no funding obligations. So some of these agreements are about co-stewardship, but with a group like the Amamutsun Land Trust with limited capacity, holding their end of the deal, so to say, can involve tens of thousands of dollars that you need to get, or 7 tribal members to be out here doing restoration for a couple months. And that's just very, very difficult sometimes. And so when there's agreements, and then the tribe is expected to do this and source their own funding, it can also feel like the tribe is taking care of the agency's land for them in a way, right? And so that also goes back to the paternalistic nature of these agreements. Next slide, please. I want to shift a little bit to talking about another mechanism for access, and that has been cultural conservation easements. So the tribe has signed 2 so far, and these are legally binding rights to a place. So this is basically, I mentioned, I think, a stepping stone. An MOU can get you rights, and then maybe the next stepping stone is an easement. Maybe the next one is land back in the future. But cultural easements are really interesting because they give tribal members that sense of security of you have legal rights to access this place in perpetuity. And that means, right, if you're going to be tending a basketry plant, and that basketry plant needs several years of tending before it's viable for harvesting for basketry materials, you can dedicate that time to building that relationship, knowing that you can't just get kicked off, the next day. Where MOUs, there's still that uncertainty, right? Maybe there's going to be a change in leadership of the agency organization or something like that, and that could really change. So in this way, it is a property right, and our tribe doesn't believe that we own anything, but the security that comes with the property rights that are legally binding can be really helpful for building those relationships and investing a lot of time and maybe resources of the community to these places. So this is a photo of a spot called the Nyland property in San Juan Bautista, California. And this is a really interesting one because there's multiple parties. It's a multi-stakeholder agreement. So there's one local land trust, the San Benito Ag Land Trust, that has the fee title and is kind of the owners of the land. There's another group, the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, that gets the cultural or the conservation easement, and then the Amamutsun Land Trust holds the cultural easement. So it's a really interesting model. So just to say, if y'all know of any places where there's already a conservation easement on the property, there still can be cultural easements that can be given to local tribal communities in addition to that, right? You don't have to only have one easement. And yeah, it involves, the process of forming the easement, I will say, involved really talking with the landowners about how the tribe will use the property, what are the interests of it, what are the rights that the tribe wants to be reserved, things like that. Next slide, please. I just want to talk about a couple other mechanisms for access, thinking about the ability to engage in place and those relationships. At Pinnacles National Park, there were some limitations with the MOU. And one limitation is that non-federally recognized tribes don't have gathering rights to national parks. In 2016, there was a change in the National Parks Service system where federally recognized tribes can harvest for cultural practices, but non-federally recognized tribes still cannot. And so what Amamutsun did about 10 years ago was get a scientific gathering permit. What's unfortunate is that scientific research is seen as more important than traditional ecological knowledge practices. I think that needs to be seen in the same way. But that has been a workaround because there are limitations. National parks were created as these big parks that displaced people, and it still has that legacy today where tribal members can't just go out and harvest legally, I'll say, go out and harvest things from pinnacles. There's also, the Joint Powers Agreement. There's where you can do more power sharing and share revenue from state parks. This is up in the Yurok community, up in Humboldt County. There's an example of that with state parks. There's no agreement where some tribal members have talked about just going out and not asking for permission on their ancestral lands, which is one pathway as well. There's the land trust model, which is the ability to hold land, and especially for non-federally recognized tribes, that's very important. And then there's also just holding fee title, like full land back, which is, I think something a lot of folks are talking about, engaging with, and I think it's really interesting to compare that approach of getting fee title to getting easements, to getting access rights through MOUs, things like that. They're all, I think, part of a big continuum of things, and as long as we center restoring those relationships to place, I think that's going to be the most critical piece of the having a good future. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about my role on the Lands Committee of the Amamutsun Land Trust. One thing that the Lands Committee does is it looks at some of the priority places for restoring access. And so what we've done is we've gone through archaeological records to look at where there are documented archaeological cultural sites, talking with elders about important places, and putting these on a confidential internal map. I think that's really important because, as one of our elders, Ed Ketchum, says, cultural sites are places of power. They have different places of, there are different components around just power broadly, but some of them have healing qualities, some of them are, beneficial for gathering, some of them are just need to be there and not disturbed, but we don't necessarily need to be out there tending them, if that makes sense. So I think this way and this path is really important for the Amamutsun Land Trust in the future to return and restore access to these places. And when we have access to these places that have, these inherent qualities to them, Eurostok is a ceremonial dance ground. When we can restore ceremony there to these places, I think that's really going to be helpful for building that worldview, right? The indigenous mindset, the relational approach to places, and maybe perhaps the restoration of traditional knowledge and Amamutsun governance systems and the revitalization of those can happen in a really good way. Next slide, please. So just some concluding thoughts. I wanted to highlight the MOU, and I'm not partial to it or anything. I think there's a lot of benefits and a lot of drawbacks to it, but I think it's an interesting tool, especially for non-federally recognized tribal communities here in California. And I encourage you all to talk to your local folks if you know anyone about MOUs or easements. I think it's really exciting. And yeah, the Amamutsun Land Trust, as Carolyn talked about as well, right? With the youth camp, with the regular community events, with the stewardship positions, employing tribal members to be land stewards. Amamutsun Land Trust is really supporting that access to place that I think is really important for all of us to learn from, right? Rebuilding and revitalizing indigenous governance systems, indigenous knowledge systems is so important for all of us living here in the Central California coast. And yeah, I think this last bullet point is just restoring tribal worldviews is really important, especially in power places. Next slide, please. So Sarah French is a wonderful staff of the Amamutsun Land Trust who couldn't be here today. And Sarah is our Director of Development for the Amamutsun Land Trust. But unfortunately, since Sarah was sick, she asked me to put this slide up, and this is just a way to support the Amamutsun. So you might see here on your left, this is about the Amamutsun Land Trust, and on your right, the Amamutsun also have a Homunya Foundation, which is another nonprofit that supports the tribe in doing cultural practices. They support some of our youth group activities, things like that. And Carolyn also mentioned the Protect Eurostok campaign. So just encourage y'all to maybe take a photo of this or anything, and if able, support. So thank you everyone for your time. Looking forward to the Q&A and lunch. Appreciate you all.
So I'd like to thank you all. That was tremendous. I want to thank Carolyn and Alexi for just a wealth of information. And my name is Liza Morel from Friends of Eurostok, one of the founding members. And so I just want to give everybody a moment, really, to reflect on so much information that has been shared here, and acknowledge both of you for your time in coming here, and open up the question and answer session. And just to note, we are running a little behind, so if people are willing to extend a little bit, we'll be breaking for lunch more like 12:20, and then extend lunch for an hour, and maybe we can shorten up the second session a little bit to stay on time, or extend it if people are interested and want to have a little more time. So we have some questions already prepared that people have submitted, but I just want to give people the opportunity to really take a moment and soak all that in and see if there's something that arises for you that you'd like more information from our speakers about now. It's such a great opportunity having them here in person, and perhaps we'll have time at lunch to connect further, but sharing our questions and creating a sense of dialogue together where it's not just what they're saying, but also really what does that mean to us in our processes as a community? How can we support the tribe in its work? And also how does this land for us? What does this mean in our lives, in our work of healing from colonizing influences, from all kinds of conditioning that we have the opportunity to learn from the wisdom of the indigenous traditions towards our own healing, towards our own empowerment and improving the future for Mother Earth and each other. So I just want to encourage everyone, if you have note cards, if you have a question, please take a moment to write it down. And we have Dora and Liz to collect questions now. And then I want to introduce Greg Cotton, will be reading the questions. So we'll have them available. Just keep percolating your thoughts, and if you have questions, they'll be down. Greg?
Yeah, so if you get your questions complete, you want to just hold it up and keep it held up, and Dora and Liz will come by in a moment in the aisle to pick those up. Thank you. Thank you. So first question is, Chairman Lopez says, as in the opening video, that in order to have healthy relationships, we all must heal. What does this mean for you, and what advice do you have for ways of non-Indigenous and institutions to do healing work? The big starter, huh?
Okay. I think, well, I've heard Chairman Lopez say that in other spaces, and he's elaborated that, you know, we're all here, like we all inherited this history of colonialism and, you know, like Indigenous people, like survivance and thriving today. And I think just looking at I think like part of it, I mean, we started here today just like hearing, like providing the space to uplift Indigenous voices. I feel like that's always a good start. But I think for me, like healing, especially looking at tribal university relationships, I see healing in the way that we do research and the way researchers, like non-Indigenous researchers, like the way they collaborate or build relationships with Indigenous communities or other Indigenous researchers. And part of the struggle is recognizing that research is a colonial practice, that, you know, research, it's very extractive, like anthropologists coming into communities, taking that knowledge, writing it down, and now it's owned by the institution. And so for me, healing looks like, how can we break down this colonial, like these practices that we all, either we learn them or like, you know, future generation of researchers, like current, you know, scholars coming up in higher ed, they're, you know, like, are they learning colonial practices of research, or are they learning about, you know, if they're going to research, because I'm in my research and what I like write and argue about is, if you're going to be researching with Indigenous people, you know, you can become their advocate to help them heal and help their community, you know, find their own wellness, but then also thinking about how you can heal and how you can create change in the area that you're in. And just, I think also like putting your best foot forward, like best practice is always taking a step back and realizing, oh, if an Indigenous person was here right now, what would they be saying? And so just thinking about how our voices are not always present. And so like having to carry our voices for us and taking our experiences with us to create those change, because we can only do so much. But yeah, that's just my like one very specific example to healing. But I think you could apply that to any area of, like, if it's education or just access to land, you know, making sure that you're honoring Indigenous people and that you're moving in a way that you're honoring what their wants and needs are.
Thank you, Carolyn. And yeah, just to add to that, maybe many of us here know that feeling where we're in the sort of fight or flight response because of so many things happening around us, where it's really easy and to make rash, quick decisions and to, you know, be rude to one another. Those sorts of things, I think, is really important to overcome for healing. And, you know, doing some reading about the Amamutsun people in the past, I read a story about how the Native people, our people would go into the river every morning, you know, into a cold river and just bathe and then come out. And just thinking about that sort of meditative practice, right, incorporated into your day-to-day life seems so powerful. So I hope all of us could cultivate some sort of, you know, practice like that, that's in relationship to place, that keeps us out of that fight or flight response so that we can continue doing the good work.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Those were awesome answers. Really. Thank you. Greg, next question.
Okay, yeah, so thank you for all your questions. We are pulling them from the online live stream also, so thank you for those online that are pulling them down. We're trying to synthesize them best we can, so thank you for your understanding of the many questions we're getting. So the next question is kind of a solidarity question. There's getting, first of all, a lot of thanks and appreciation for your what you're presenting and for being here. There's a lot of interest in like how we want to know how to be good friends with the tribe. We want to be in solidarity with you, and we want to figure out like how.
Can you answer
that? I'd rather you did. But yeah, so like what does the tribe want to see? Like how can people engage with the tribe and like maybe even partnership with you like that? Please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have the experience and the journey of trying to partner with the tribe in that way, and I feel like, you know, Friends of Huristock has done a great job in doing that, in cultivating the trust, right? That's so important. And, you know, I feel like sometimes it can feel tricky how to navigate supporting and engaging with local Indigenous communities. There's maybe a fear of appropriation, which is very valid, and that happens sometimes. But I feel like the supporting Indigenous knowledges and supporting Indigenous peoples and understanding that what will be created is something that will be generally inclusive, right? And can provide teachings and philosophies on how to live in our world. I'm reminded of Kutcha Risling Baldy's talks about land back. Kutcha's a Hoopa California native scholar. And she jokes that she's like, well, not everyone's going to be welcome. There's going to be, you know, the Jeff Bezos of the world who, you know, destroy our environment, and maybe they're not going to be welcome in this future. I love that approach. But also, I think just wholly, it is inclusive, and it will be, I think, a way that isn't going to be appropriative for a future. So just supporting the relationships that people have to place and all those things, supporting access that's something, of course, I feel so deeply about. Is really important.
Yeah, I think just to add, I think to me, I see the importance of sharing knowledge. And so I think I see it as a privilege to be able to like dedicate my graduate career to learning our history. And so I think a lot about, you know, like I'm at UCLA right now, and so I have to learn and share knowledge with the Tongva Gabrielino people. And so I think just recognizing that when we have access to learning something, it's a privilege, and that there's others that in your families, in your community, in your networks, where they might not have access to learning about like our history or learning about the true violence at missions. And so I think just continuing, like if, you know, continuing to spread the word and share your knowledge about Indigenous people with others, because I think at the end of the day, for me, the biggest struggle is recognizing that not all of society understands our struggles and understands the work that we're trying to accomplish. And I feel like I can't dedicate my whole life to educating the public, that I need the public to also stand up and educate itself too. But at the same time, that's why we have to share knowledge, and thank you, and just like allowing Indigenous people to do their work that they want to do, to find their passion, to connect with their culture, but also to like provide spaces like this for today where we can come and share our knowledge, but then you taking the next step is like, who can you share this knowledge with and educate in your public or your daily life? Because I just hope that in the future we have a lot more understanding from the larger public and less resistance to the work that we're trying to do, because this is like lifelong work that we're dedicating our lives to. So it's like lifelong drama that we have to heal from. And so I think just continuing your healing by educating yourself.
Thank you both. That was a deep question, and there's so much in it. And so I want to encourage everyone to hold that as we go through the day, and find the ways that we can support the tribe, and we can spread the word in our communities and in our relationality, and also how we can grow how we are as human beings, because that also, our being makes a difference in the world as a matter of how we stand. Greg? Next question.
Yeah, so this one is from Caitlin, I think. Someone said that Herstock is getting destroyed by a quarry and that it affects us all, or that it affects us. How does it affect us?
Yeah, so for context, for those of you who may not be familiar, there's a proposed sand and gravel mine right at Herstock. And so right now there's a permitting process where the developers are trying to get this permit to do a 400-acre sand and gravel mine at the heart of a sacred site. I feel like for me, how we would all be affected is just being complicit in lacking a spine to stand up and support our knowledge, Indigenous people's sacred places, right? And so I think we all need to hold ourselves accountable in making decisions that fall in line with how our value system is, and that should include all people's right to practice ceremony in their ways, especially Indigenous peoples whose lands are unceded and were stolen from them. So really, I think we all lose when one culture can't practice their culture.
And then I just want to add that we, like us as humans, we are a part of this ecosystem in the world. And so if there is like great gravel and mining and all that, like we're talking about like air pollution in the area, we're talking about, oh my God, why am I blanking now? But for example, like if you're living in the area, then you would be, hearing all the noise that's taking place. So it's like impacting the animals and the sounds that they hear. So then it's like the air and then even the water. So it's like, like if you look at it as a whole ecosystem and then you look at how it impacts one thing and how it impacts the others, like us humans, we are a part of that. Like we're gonna breathe the same air and experience, like we might not be there and be that specific, like I mentioned earlier, the California tiger salamander, like we might not be that specific species, but once that species is lost, it hits a ripple effect with all of humanity within our whole system of our animals and like all the animals that are going extinct. And so I think we also have to think about the animals and protecting them. And so I think like that's kind of what's at stake. It's recognizing that we are part of the ecosystem that's also at loss here, that's also going to be impacted like physically in some way or the other, and how that impacts our health.
Thank you both so much, really. And for people who want to get involved or find different ways, we have the table in the back here outside the auditorium for Friends of Eurostock, and there are really a lot of different ways to connect. And I just want to reflect that, the process that we're going through is one of really listening, right? Really listening to all the different aspects that are going on, and the acknowledgement that can come from that in our awareness, in what we learn, in how that lands for us, then the intention that we create from that, and then the actions that get taken in our relationality, in our connecting. So it's powerful work that we're doing today, and I appreciate everybody's questions and listening. Greg?
Couple more. So this one comes, I'm just going to read it. I think it's very moving and powerful. I am a community college instructor in Gilroy, very near the Huristock site. I am interested in the power and possibilities of this work to heal. But this semester, I am experiencing my students having increasing difficulty in their lives as students because of despair, depression, and sorrow. It shows up in the classroom as low motivation and inability to focus. The teachers, too, are suffering. What advice might you provide for building a healthy collaboration between the campus and the tribal band near Gilroy, or near Huristock?
Well,
And just to add a little bit, I think there's been also many questions about really how to be in communication with you, like where to find resources or information and how to collaborate as educators and as individuals.
I think just briefly, I'll say that I feel like people forget that we're still in a pandemic. And I think like returning to school, especially being a graduate student, like that sorrow that we're talking about, I feel like we're all humans and we're still recovering from like being locked away in our rooms and social distancing and not being connected to our communities. And so for me, like, I feel like that has something to do with it, but also, like, I think because of what happened and recognizing, I feel like part of the sorrow is also recognizing what's happening in society, and like we're talking, like the war that's going on, the genocide that's going on, and how even me, when I was hearing that question, I was like, I feel like that's me. Like, I also feel like, it's sad and depressing to try to do this work as like an Indigenous scholar or even a community member working for the tribe. I just feel that there's so many emotions and there's so much trauma that's going on that we're all going through. And I think part of it is recognizing that we're human first, because I feel like it's a colonial practice to just pretend that your feelings don't exist or to just keep pushing forward and to meet your deadline and to get things done. And so I feel like with school, it's the same thing. And it's like you got to read your assignments and get your homework in, get your deadlines in. And so I just feel that like it's okay to not produce and to take a step back and say like, I'm not okay. I can't work on this right now. And so I just feel that it's really important that teachers and professors have really good relationships with their students, especially anybody that we're teaching. Because I also, just side note, we're all teachers in our own way, and so just recognizing that we all have something to share. And so I just feel that both teachers and students, and it's like recognizing that things are not okay and that we don't have answers or solutions, and that also just recognizing that I would say, I know this is being recorded probably, but in a lot of ways, our government is failing us. And so I think that has to go with us recognizing that we're depressed for a reason and that we're humans and that we're just trying to make it through. And of course, as Indigenous people, we feel it like differently. I would say I feel more of that historical trauma and that violence that I have to live through because I'm engaging with that as I do my research or work with the community. But I don't know if sorry, that's just what I have to say.
I mean, I'll just add, there's so many dimensions to this question. One thing I will say is, when thinking about trying to engage with folks like Chairman Lopez or other tribal council members, these people live 3-4 hours away, are kind of like booked, have a lot of meetings, maybe have a full-time job. Land back could be one possibility though, right? So if you think about it, the ability to engage with Gavilan, if someone like Chairman Lopez, I'm not going to speak for him, not that he wants to do this, but like could live in Gilroy and be able to say, hey neighbor, like I'm on Gavilan, I could easily be right there, I could easily grab a bite to eat, right? That ability to have a relationship with somebody that's your neighbor, not just like you're on their ancestral land, but you literally live next to them, would be so much different than asking somebody to drive 3 hours for a 1 hour meeting. Sorry, 3 hours each way for a 1 hour meeting or something like that, right? So just thinking about the capacity and thinking about what providing housing could look like in this area in terms of relationships.
Thank you so much. It was great, and reconnecting with the land and with each other and how to be in community. We're running short of time before lunch, and I'm sure people are ready for a break.
One more?
One more question? We have time? People up for a short question? All right, for closing.
Okay. So land acknowledgements. This is something we're hearing more about, and like people are practicing and putting in their own, institutions and events. So why land acknowledgements, and what do you think is the most important thing to include in them?
Well, for me, that's a challenging question, just because I feel like when I first started hearing about land acknowledgements, or like when UC Santa Cruz wrote one about like the Waswas people, I was very happy, and I felt like, oh, we're like finally representation, like we're talking about the land that we're on. And I feel like that's just the first step. And I think, I feel like I worry that this is the challenge part for me, is worrying that people they think that the land acknowledgement, just by acknowledging that you're on Indigenous land, that they're good, that you're done. And I feel like that's not the case. Like, that's just the first step, because the next step is about how can you support the Indigenous communities of the land that you're on. And like, for example, with us, like Amo Mutsun, like we need support in order to keep coming out here to, to help support Waswas people, but also like being able to reconnect with our like San Juan Bautista and like Uristock and Gilroy area. And so I just feel that, sorry, I'm losing my focus here. What was I saying? What's the question again?
Land acknowledgement.
I'm sorry. But so the land acknowledgement, like as you can see, there's so many pathways that my mind can just race, and I can talk about the different ways that how much more Indigenous people need support, and that land acknowledgement is not enough. And so I think, like, going back to, that's what I wanted to say about like protect your stock. It's like recognizing when Indigenous people are speaking up about something, when they're more than likely talking about how important their land is to them. More than likely, Indigenous people are leading climate change actions. And so I think just recognizing where you can support Indigenous people and where you can like support the work that they're doing to fight for their land or to gain access to their land and to get land back. And because it's different for every community, so it's also, you can't just homogenize everybody and say, oh, the land acknowledgement is good and problem solved. Like, no, we actually have to go to every specific California Native tribe, every other tribe in the US, to actually talk about their relationship to their land and how to honor their culture and honor their history. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I know we're all getting hungry, and every word I say leads us further and further away from lunch, but one thing I think about is the importance of us getting into uncomfortable conversations sometimes. I think that is really great and is a potential that land acknowledgements can create. Sometimes they just sweep something under the rug, though, but it could make us all uncomfortable and kind of engage in a conversation where we're like, yeah, this was really messed up what happened. There was a genocide here. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how we're complicit, how we approach it, and what we can do together. And I will say, as someone learning how to do public speaking, I have a hard time making people feel uncomfortable, but I kind of want to if it helps, right? And I feel like a land acknowledgement can be done by institutions and can be kind of their own internal process and of making that uncomfortable conversation happen.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. We're excited to have the second part of our day today. And a couple of details before we start. We're going to change up a little bit the format for the questions and answers after this. And we had created myself as a moderator before to kind of bridge in with the questions and collating them, but we're going to simplify things. And I apologize if I put an overlay on hearing directly from our speakers this morning, so we'll simplify that. Okay, and so I want to introduce our panelists and speakers for this afternoon. They are part of the Critical Mission Studies project that happened at UCSC, and we're going to hear from them about that. And I'd like to introduce them on stage. We have Renia Ramirez, they're here. And she's an enrolled member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, professor of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. Her research interests include critical mission studies, urban Native Americans, Native feminism, family tribal history and ethnography, settler colonialism, environmental justice, and Ho-Chunk studies. Next, we have Daisy Martin on the end there. Big round of applause. Daisy is the founding director of the History and Civics Project at UCSC and teaches history, social science teacher candidates in the UCSC Master of Arts Credential Program. She's an Organization of American Historians member, a distinguished lecturer, and has worked on and published about multiple public history and teaching projects. And in the middle, we have Dr. Judith Scott. Professor Emerita from the University of California, Santa Cruz, Department of Education, retired after 22 years of service in 2021. She's an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation and the first Indigenous scholar inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame, an organization that honors literacy scholars. During her career, she developed innovative approaches to vocabulary learning and assessment, working closely with classroom teachers to help non-dominant students become aware of the power of language and the integrated use of multicultural children's literature and writing. Currently, or past, the principal investigator for the Central California Writing Project. Currently, good, thank you. Currently, working to amplify Indigenous voices in the K-12 classrooms. Her work is published in numerous scholarly books and journals. Her most recent publication, When the Mission Bells Rang, is a child-friendly picture book. There we go. That introduces the concept of resistance and resilience among Indigenous people that were held captive in California missions. And she's going to be reading from the book. And we will have that also, the beautiful pictures on slide. And that book is also available near the Friends of Yerstock table for people who are interested in taking that home and sharing it. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The title of our talk is Restoring Indigenous History, Telling the Truth, and Being a Respectful Ally. So before we begin, we have to really honor the Amamutsun Tribal Band, who, we've been working in collaboration with them. Valentin Lopez was really involved with us every step of the way, involved in lots of meetings with him, phone calls, and we would check in with him constantly to make sure whatever we were doing was okay with him as tribal chairman as well as the tribal council. And then also Alexi Sagona, who talked earlier this morning, who's a UC Berkeley doctoral candidate, Carolyn Rodriguez, UCLA doctoral candidate, Dr. Rob Cuthrell, Research Associate for the Amamutsan Tribal Band, Rick Flores, Director of Horticulture and Steward of the Amamutsan Relearning Program at UCSC Arboretum. So, and I also want to mention that we worked with the Indigenous Faculty Network at UCSC and would share how we were doing, and they were very helpful. Yes. You're going to change the slides? Okay. Oh. Yes. I see that's a problem. Okay, it's a problem. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, that's what I just talked about. So, shout out, Amamutsan Tribal Band. Woo! Shout out! Okay, so the next slide. So our group was the UC Santa Cruz Humanities Lab that's part of the Critical Mission Studies $1 million grant that we got from the UC Office of the President. There were 4 principal investigators from UCLA, UCSD, UCR, and then here. I want to, so the 4 PIs, the original group, Charlene Villasenor Black, Ross Frank, Jennifer Sherpa Hughes, and then Amy Lone Tree was actually in the beginning, so I just want to honor that she was there in the beginning. And then she had to step down, so then I became the co-PI for UCSC. So basically, this was a larger grant where we all worked in collaboration with California Indians across the state. And in order to work in collaboration, we had a California Indian Advisory Board, and then we would, anything that we did, we would have people vote about it. We also had lots of committees because we shared, because there was this money, the money was given to people who wrote proposals. And so our group, Judy Scott was the one that had this idea about developing curriculum about the California missions from an indigenous perspective. So I want to give a shout out to Judy Scott. Yay, Judy! Woo! And of course, Daisy Martin has been very important as well. Yay! Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to be talking about, and we'll all be talking about, is we, as part of this Critical Mission Studies grant, we developed a book anthology, which is called Introducing Critical Mission Studies, and it's under contract with UC Press. So we're hoping by presenting presenting our different parts of our chapters, then you'll be interested in getting it. Like, oh wow, this sounds really cool. I want to get this book. So this is like to get you guys interested. And so basically, because we were all so busy as part of this group trying to develop curriculum, we ended up writing 3 different chapters that'll be part of this book. So you want to, next slide? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the chapter that I worked on, Amamutsan, Truth-Telling, and Multi-Generational Methodology. And so basically I wrote the first draft and then shared it with everybody, and people gave me feedback. So that, next, so just to say, these are all the people part of this paper. Me, Valentin Lopez, Judy Scott, Daisy Martin, Carolyn Rodriguez, Alexi Sagona, and Charlie Brooks. And Charlie Brooks is a doctoral candidate at UCSC in the education department. Next slide. So the chapter that I want to honor Alexi Sagona and Carolyn Rodriguez, who were the ones who did the interviewed people and did oral history interviews of Amma Mutsun. So they're very pivotal to this project. And this was, of course, really important because we started this project when COVID hit. And so it was like, COVID hit, how are we gonna do this? How's the interviewing gonna happen? So, you know, interviews ended up being done outside or on Zoom. Like both Carolyn and Alexi were incredibly creative with how to do these interviews in a safe manner. So this chapter, it's about Amma Mutsun truth-telling about the San Juan Bautista mission and Santa Cruz mission, cultural revival, decolonization in response to missions, genocide, and land loss. And just to say a little bit more about Alexi and Carolyn, well, first of all, aren't they awesome? Yay! Yes! Shout out. I hope they both get jobs in the UC system. Just throwing it out there. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So they collected these Amma Mutsun oral histories, and Valentin Lopez, in the tribal chair of the Amma Mutsun tribal band, he told stories of contemporary and mission periods, and basically he always talks about we have to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth about what happened in the missions. So telling the truth is bearing witness to what truly happened and is part of healing and decolonization. And the reason why this is so important, I'm an anthropologist, so just letting you know, some anthropologists and historians question the veracity of oral testimonies unless supported by documents that are often influenced by colonial perspectives. So getting at the truth, in order to do that, you really have to talk to, you know, in this case, the Amma Mutsun tribal band, tribal members. You have to talk to them and hear their perspective of the history. Because if you just go into the archives, often a lot of the material there are infused with colonial perspectives. Next slide. So Lopez in the interview, it was Alexi Sagona who interviewed him. He tells an Amma Mutsun historical perspective that challenges the Spanish colonial fantasy that his ancestors wanted to live and work in the missions, and Spanish missionaries were protectors and benefactors. So some of the themes that came out in his interview, and this is just a few, the Spanish forcibly kidnapped his ancestors. There was horrible Spanish abuse, the Spanish rape of women. He talked about how his ancestors were confined in hot and stinky one-room barracks. Often the women at night, they were locked in these barracks at night, and this is where often where the raping would happen. But because of this very unsanitary conditions, there was lots of spread of disease and much death for his ancestors. For San Juan Bautista mission and Santa Cruz mission, it was between 85 or 90% of people who his ancestors that came to the missions, they died. So it was a mass death. Next slide. So Valentin Lopez talked about how in response to this Spanish rape, Amamutsan, the ancestors enacted tribal justice. At the Santa Cruz mission, his ancestors killed Father Quintana as a consequence for his sexual assault of the wife of an indigenous leader. Next slide. So this is just a quote from his oral history interview. Quote, Indians had to make the clay tiles for the missions. When you look closely, you notice a thumbprint is missing. This missing thumbprint is a result of how they, his ancestors, were forced to march tied by their thumbs when captured by the Spanish soldiers and forced to the missions. Unquote. Next slide. So basically, in his oral history interview, he added to the Amamutsan archive, where there was this combining of oral histories with various kinds of evidence, including missing thumbprints in tiles, scholarly work, the Harrington papers, and archival documents. Harrington was this linguistic anthropologist who did all these interviews, so there's a lot of material there. So basically, our project was getting at these oral histories that challenge the colonial narrative. And so, you know, if you're thinking of an Amamutsan archive, you know, you're going to have oral histories, maps, stories, documents, material that the Amamutsan are collecting, including the Harrington papers. Next slide. So by passing down the memories of the missions, Amamutsans dispute Spanish colonial versions of history. Lopez's grandmother shared Spanish abuse and his ancestors' resistance. So he gave an example of how an ancestor refused to stop speaking his tribal language, and the Spanish cut his tongue out as punishment. And he basically was saying that Spanish abuse was planned acts of terror. The priests ordered the soldiers to cut out his ancestors' tongue as a warning for others to stop speaking their tribal languages. Next slide. So Carolyn Rodriguez, who you got to hear from in the morning, in the interview, Alexi interviewed Carolyn, and she shared her attendance at the removal of a mission bell at UC Santa Cruz. Valentin Lopez had worked with UC Santa Cruz administrators to remove the bell, and the ceremony happened on June 21st, 2019. And Lopez also worked with the Santa Cruz City Council so that all the mission bells could be removed in Santa Cruz. 5 minutes? Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, wow, I'm gonna have to be fast. Okay, next slide. So, Carolyn Rodriguez, quote, "The bells are a symbol of genocide and forced conversion during the mission period. Our ancestors lived their lives according to the bells, so the bells have a genocidal narrative behind the sound," unquote. She analyzed how placing mission bells along Highway 101 is a, quote, route of tourism, unquote, and, quote, route of the Spanish colonizers, unquote. So basically, removing the mission bells is an act of decolonization. Next slide. So Carolyn Rodriguez, she talked about how she's walked with the Amamutsan land stewards to the top of Mount Umunun, their sacred mountain. She walked to protect Jurastack, Amamutsan sacred land, from gravel and sand companies' extractive capitalist endeavors to dig a quarry and destroy Amamutsan territory. And so walking on sacred Amamutsan land helps Rodriguez reclaim Amamutsan culture and identity, and his radical resistance against colonial attempts to eliminate her Amamutsan culture, identity, and tribal nation. Next slide. Alexi Sagona he talked about decolonizing history. Quote, "Only when you learn an alternate history and an alternate narrative that you really see how gross and sad the hegemonic narrative of the Spanish missions is and how harmful it is for Native people and their identity. He learned the true history in college. He lamented that he did not learn the true history earlier in middle schools and at the missions. He said, quote, and that probably damaged my ability to have an Amamutsan identity at a young age because of the imagery, the ideas and conceptions about being California Indian. And it wasn't like California Indians are still here, unquote." So shout out to Valentin Lopez, Alexi Sagona, and Carolyn Rodriguez, who've been very involved. They interviewed more people, but these are just the ones that I'm talking about. And I'm gonna shift it over to Daisy.
Thanks, Renya, and thanks to you all for being here. The next slide shows my organization up at UCSC, which, or maybe it's 2 slides down, yeah, which is the History and Civics Project, which I started with Professor George Bunch about 5 years ago, and we've had it focuses on supporting K-12 history and social science instruction, high quality, and supporting teachers through building communities K-16 amongst teachers, scholars, community educators, and organizations. And I've had I've been humbled and pleased and honored to work with this group for 3+ years on trying to support local and regional teachers in changing what happens or sustaining good things that are happening in the classroom. So Professor Ramirez stopped with Alexi's talk about what it meant to sit in schools. And if we go 2 slides down, I would imagine that you also, it wasn't just Alexi that remains troubled by what happened in terms of learning about the mission system or in learning about the indigenous people both in California, in this region, nationally and globally. And this might have been an experience that you had, which was maybe building a mission, or possibly your friend or family or young friends have done this. And so our project was really to finally abandon this project. And yeah. It's about time, right? So, and the problems are myriad, and we could spend hours talking about all the problems with this, but I'll just say that, obviously the indigenous perspectives and experiences are absent from this project. The story that it glamorizes is factually incorrect, and it's rooted in a colonial fantasy. The focus becomes on architecture and buildings, and we learn very little about what it meant when the missions came to this region. So we started thinking about abandoning this project and how we could support teachers in doing that. And what we found is that educators, both in the K-12 public school system but outside, are just anxious and ready to do this work. And so we did we've been working with educators not only in grade 4 and 3 and 5, but we have also had educators from other grades, high school, et cetera. And it was heartening to see how teachers are ready to do this and anxious for good resources. So the next slide, no, this is like the balancing act, which, so the chapter that where we talk about what this might look like and the work that we've done so far is called Exposing the Cover-Up, Critical Truth-Telling and Teaching the California Missions. And that is part of the anthology. So I want you to imagine, instead of starting with those mission projects and models of them, starting with some different images. And so this next slide shows an image of the bell removal ceremony that took place in 2019 at UCSC. And you see Chairman Lopez and others. And the next slide is an image from the flyer for the bell removal event that happened in 2021, where Santa Cruz City got rid of their final and last mission bell because of Amma Mutsun and community activism. And so one might imagine starting here in a K-12 classroom, in a grade 4 classroom, where students could look at this image and they could start generating questions. And there's a thinking routine that's used in a lot of classrooms called See, Think, Wonder. And so you can imagine young learners, we could do this as more senior learners. What do you see here? What do you think? And what are you wondering? And so sort of looking, and you might get all kinds of questions that you can imagine. And then we might go, so once they looked closely at this, we might investigate the 5 W's, the, who, what, where, like what is going on here? And you remember that those 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, why, right? So why is this happening? So here we're starting in the present and going back. And the next slide shows, I think, oh, this is another image from that bell removal ceremony, which we could also use in the same way. Go, what's going on? This, I believe, these are Sentinel photos that I'm showing, which I didn't get the rights to, but this is educational purposes. But this is Louise J. Miranda Ramirez, who is the tribal chairwoman of the Ohlone Costanoan Esselen Nation, talking at that bell removal ceremony. But once the students are propelled into the why did this bell removal ceremony happen, the next slide shows a sentence from that flyer, which maybe some of you saw. It's a beautiful flyer. And it actually has this sentence, mission bells symbolize the enslavement of indigenous people in the California mission system. Now, there's some vocabulary in there that young students may not know, but teachers are adept at figuring out how to bring them into these new words. And so that might propel us into even more questions once we say, well, so that's one of the answers to why, but that we can then imagine, and we're seeing some of this. I'm doing the imagination thing because we're kind of imagining what it might look like in a classroom together. The next slide shows all kinds of questions that we could then study for 2 weeks, for 4 weeks, for however long we have in terms of building students' knowledge about this history, as well as understanding of how narratives work. And so I'm not going to read all these, but questions like when and where are we talking about? What's the history of the Santa Cruz mission? Well, how would we learn that history? How do we know what we know? Who do we need to talk to? What sources and facts can we use to study this past? What perspective story is easily found? What perspective stories are missing? How can we correct the dominant story? And the last two is like, well, if these mission bells supposedly memorialize this period of history, how should we memorialize and commemorate the Native peoples that were impacted by the missions based on what we have learned, and what informed actions can we take today to tell truthful stories and repair past harms? And you can see how some of these answers propel us into protecting Eurostock as well. So, and listening to the Amma Mutsun. So it's sort of a different view of what we teach and learn in the California public school and private school landscape for youngsters. And I wanted to also make the point on the next slide that in the doing of this, we're all learning. And so one of the things that we continue to go back to, and I'll show you some resources, but you'll see that some of those resources are resources for adult learners. I'm learning. Carolyn and Alexi this morning talked about learning. We are all learning together. But this is a nice article that Chairman Lopez wrote with Professor Ramirez that talks about these mission bells and what the purposes were and some of the history behind it. So I want to make that point. So then let me just take you to another piece of this. Well, wait, sorry. We can stay here for a second. I want to make 2 points. One is, notice what's different here. We're starting with the Amma Mutsun today, rather than indigenous folks as living only in the past. Notice that we are starting with Indigenous voice. We are starting with Indigenous experience. And we're not only starting there, we're going to center it. Center Amamutsan voices and center Indigenous voices and perspectives and experiences and ask questions about how we know. But the other thing that's happening is we're moving away from this idea of history as a single story that's told by the textbook, because that's never been anything that we really should call history. We could call it something else. And so we're inviting students in to ask questions about the past and then create interpretations and make judgments about that using artifacts and all the varied kinds of sources that can inform that. So those are two key conceptual differences. And then I want to show you one more example, which is about challenging this dominant narrative. So the next slide shows and I'm not going to read these to you, but on the left side, we see Chairman Lopez's words about, we've made this question, what relationship did California Indians have with the land? Like, that's a question that's worthy of we've already heard lots of good stuff to learn, right? Just today. But on the left, we see Chairman Lopez's words. On the right, we see a textbook that sort of represents textbooks. It's not because this one is horribly bad. It's just textbooks are mostly the same. And without reading these, just because of time, I'll just show you that once we invite students into doing these things, you start to see some important differences that they can see. And so Chairman Lopez starts with, we took care of the fish. On the textbook, it says the Indians had used the lands, different kinds of verbs, right? We made sure that the rivers were clean. My highlighting got lost in the formatting. So there's another piece that's contradictory to that on the other side. Let me pick the one that's easy. We've got Chairman Lopez talking about caring for and stewarding these lands, whereas the textbook is talking about hunting and gathering, as if it was completely passive. So anyway, what we're doing is we're asking students to notice that there's difference, to understand that history needs multiple sources, multiple accounts, that it needs to consider perspectives of all who were involved. And also, there's opportunities for talking about how language creates narrative. We're inviting them in to at least start thinking about how historical narratives are created and can either silence groups and and build for a more social just world, or tell one side of the story, or can try to get as true a story as possible. Okay, so ongoing, and I'll just say a word, and this is necessary. On the left side, in the next slide, there is a picture from Deb Miranda's book, Bad Indians, where her daughter, I think, or her child, comes home with a coloring book, and she takes the page out of the coloring book and marks it all up. And it's like the story of this particular mission, she's interrogating that text. And the reason we've got to talk back to these narratives, we have to talk back to the text because they're everywhere. And on the right side, you see a 1950 edition of a book on the California missions, which the Santa Cruz mission starts with, like, the first 3 paragraphs don't have anything about the fact that there were people already here. And then it goes on to use language that suggests that the Native people, Indian help could not be counted upon, is part of it. So this is, and granted that's 1950, but we wouldn't have to go too far to find that surrounding us. So we've got to start interrogating these narratives and try to get to more truth. So one of the things we've been trying to do is create these both gather and develop and create in collaboration these easy-to-use curriculum resources. So the next slide shows the curriculum that Carolyn mentioned this morning. This is the Protect Eurostat curriculum, which is on the website, the Protect Eurostat website. And it's having these kinds of resources that are available for, teachers work really hard. So, to show you an example of what can happen, the next slide, I think it's the next slide. Oh, no, well, before here, actually, can we go to the next one and then come back to this? Thank you. Oh, no, I'm just off. Okay, well, let me just tell you. We can go back up, yeah. So we had one teacher who is teaching in a high school close to Protect Eurostock, who took those Protect Eurostock resources and actually, what happened to the slide? Sorry. And turned it into a whole set of resources for her high school students, where she's using principles of reclaiming Native truth and using Amma Mutsun excerpts from the website and turned it into a whole curriculum. And so now we've shared that curriculum with other high school teachers who will take it and learn from it and make it work for their students. So that's, yeah, and this isn't, these aren't all the people, but these are the people who deserve your applause. They're educators who are working really hard already, and they're like, something is amiss, and how can we come together and actually engage students in learning more accurate history, learning to think historically, and learning how to center Indigenous perspectives, experiences, and ways of knowing in the regular high school and K-12 curriculum. So, yeah, let's give them a round of applause. And then, so I'll just give you a sense. The next slide is we have this sort of what I've been calling a beta site because it's not quite where we want it to be, but it does have literature. It has some teachers' lessons. It has, we're building it more. It's definitely, it starts with the Amma Mutsun. If you see the menu bar at the top, it's a place you can go to find out more about the Amma Mutsun, which basically it takes you to the Amma Mutsun websites. And there is the lesson that I was talking about on the right-hand side, done by the high school teacher who was using the Reclaiming Native Truths along with the Protect Eurostock materials. And we have other teachers who have done similarly inspiring things. And we come together and talk about it. So one of the things that happens, and this will be my last bit, one of the things that happens is that, you know, there's the realities of schooling and what is expected and what kinds of things govern the school day and how much time there is and what you're supposed to teach. And so we're working to try to both articulate what those challenges are and then see how we can make things happen within the real life challenges. And one of the questions we get a lot is like, well, this history is so violent. I don't want to tell my fourth graders about this history. I'll just say, and then another concern is, you know, you see what's happening in this country about teaching history. Like, it's getting outlawed in some states, no history allowed. So, and that's a reality for hardworking educators. So, one thing I want to pull up a little, the next slide has a little bit of research just to give you, you know, a sense of two important things. Is Professor Harper Keenan, who is now in Canada and was a grade school teacher in the States before getting his PhD, investigated what's going on with teaching the missions in K-12 schools. And he comes up with something called ritual avoidance, which is a repeated social practice that relies on the designed obscuring of known information that would threaten a narrative central to the identity of a dominant group. Yeah, cool, right? Like that's, I mean, I don't mean it's cool, but I just mean like it captures something, right, that's important to think about. And another thing that Harper Keenan finds, just in terms of the violence question, and here I'm going to make sure I get the data correct, but if I can, in the middle of all this, but he basically finds that he goes through some textbooks and he looks at how is violence addressed in grade 4 California textbooks. And he finds that there is violence in those textbooks and that the indigenous acts of violence on settlers is mentioned more than settler violence on indigenous folks. So I don't have the numbers for you, but that's another important piece. So we have talked about how to manage the violence in age-appropriate ways. But this is about teaching hard history, and if we're going to teach truth, that's a piece of it. But then I'll just end my comments, I think, with the next slide, if I'm right. Yes, and this is from an article that was written by Professor Sim Schneider and Professor Kyle Schneider and Professor Lee Panich. The Schneiders are members of the Grayton Renteria tribe. And I think it's an important message for all of us that we've heard throughout the day, is that they argue that for interpretations of the missions and broader popular conversation that make indigenous persistence and resilient relationships to meaningful cultural landscapes the cardinal priorities in the study of indigenous responses to colonization, and not secondary attributes of narratives of confinement and colonial dominance. Our view of the missions is shaped by the unquestionable reality that modern California tribes reflect a remarkable story of resistance and resilience, a legacy of refusing colonialism and rebuilding. They continue, mission interpretation might foreground such radical concepts as persistence and mobility. So I can't say it better than that. I would say that our work continues. We draw on several themes that help us stay focused. The next slide has some of those, which are local, land, counter-narratives, language and how language shapes the way the story is told, inquiry, facing hard histories, resistance, and healing. And another piece of curriculum with a lot of potential and that teachers are finding really useful, it's shown on the next slide, which my colleague, Professor Scott, wrote. And we'll be working with this in a minute, but I just want to say that this is being used by some teachers in our locality. It's not only at the elementary school, but also at the high school, in conjunction with larger text sets, as education people like to talk about. You see there's all different kinds of texts or sources that can be combined with this book to investigate the history. On the right, you see a map that I think is Professor Martinez's map. And then there's a picture of the Higueras who were interviewed by Alexi. And there's things like graphs about what happened with the births at the mission. So we continue to try to make easily accessible, accurate, indigenous-centered materials. It's not fast, but gosh, is it important.
Okay, I can't talk as fast as Daisy. There's no way. But, Osio Toheja. I'm Judy Scott. I'm an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm going to talk about this chapter that we wrote. And it reflects a lot of the different themes that we've heard throughout the day today. So, next slide, please. The main concept of this chapter is that communities, whether they're universities or affinity groups or clubs or schools, whoever is working with indigenous communities needs to actually reach out and talk to the communities, the indigenous communities where they're located, because unless they do, it's going to be really hard to actually explore that history. And as Daisy pointed out, that history just gets whitewashed. It gets sort of put to the side. And so talking to the local councils is really the best way to find out about local indigenous history. Also, next slide. Collaboration never occurs in a vacuum, and it's important to realize that it's always set in a particular context with a particular set of people and in a particular moment in history. And we need to keep this in mind, particularly because there is historical mistrust among different communities, especially given the unbalanced way that history has been presented in the past and the subjugation and enslavement of indigenous peoples in California. So next slide. We're often asked how our collaboration came about with the Amamutsun Tribal Band and how we were able to have such close ties. And I just want to sort of recapture that because our collaboration is really built on 14 years of working together with UCSC and the Amamutsun Tribal Band. In 2008, the director of the American Indian Resource Center heard about the Amamutsun Tribal Band working at Año Nuevo, and he approached Cheryl Lopez and said, hey, we'd like to work with you too. And so they started this Amamutsun speaker series that has been going on for 25 different events. And every fall and spring, we have, there's a advisory committee that's made up of university people and Amamutsun Tribal Band members, and we talk about who do we want to hear, who would be somebody who would be important to bring in to present indigenous perspectives to the university. So that started. Dennis also raised $10,000 and created a big mural that's up on across from the Resource Center that depicts the tribes in this area and the local history, and then named the meeting rooms after that. So all of those things are so important just in this community, creating this community together. And then we're also, Val's amazing. He does so much for UCSC and for this area, and it's just incredible. He's participated on the hiring committees for the American Indian Resource Center directors. He's part of the repatriation committee to when UCSC was built. Some of the ancestors' remains were disrupted, and so they're trying to rebury them. And then also he's part now of the UCOP Native American Advisory Committee, and he can consult directly with the Office of the President for the UC. So he's just really developed this incredible ties with the UC system. And then as a result of that, things like the bell removal can happen, right? So it's really been this 14-year building of trust and relationship. Oops, that was cool. So next slide. Yeah. So when we were looking at this collaboration, we used both cultural historic activity theory and the idea of community-based participatory research as sort of guiding principles. And so the first one sort of says that history and cultural context influences how communities perceive and act toward a common goal. And the participatory research group talks about the idea that you need to have all parties equitably involved in all phases of the research. And so that's sort of what we did. The next slide, please. Our common goal was the development of this truthful K-12 curriculum. And the Amamutsun Tribal Band, had this rich archive that Renia was talking about. Alexi and Carolyn conducted interviews. The tribal council controlled all of the historical and tribal documents, and they had a final say on everything that we produced. And as the UCSC community, we were professors and doctoral students and allies who really produced things and facilitated this curriculum building, but it was all within this context of always getting approval and always having lots of communication with the Amamutsun Tribal Band. There was this mutual respect and deference to everything, from the tribe. And it was clear from the outset that our authority as academics was not more important or more valued than the wishes of the Amamutsun tribal band. And I think that's sort of critical. So, thank you. Next slide. So, one of the things that this chapter does is it sort of outlines some guidelines for collaboration. So I'm going to go through those now. We need to have a trusting, respectful relationship with local tribal authorities in order to have a collaborative community. And really a good starting point is to go to their websites, read their materials, talk to them at social and cultural events. If you're an outsider, those are ways you can sort of begin to know people and invite them in to what you're doing. You need to have these meetings. Setting them up is not that hard. You know, there's usually a tribal chairman or somebody who's willing to talk to you. We're not that scary. You know, you can just call us up. And then getting to know the tribal members on a personal level helps gain that trust and respect. And Alexi talked about this morning. It's just so important to have that trust and respect. And that happens among people. It doesn't happen between institutions, it happens among people. Next slide, please. So this equitable partnership and approval is crucial. We challenged the power dynamic that usually puts university professors, administrators, and staff above the perspective and knowledge of Indigenous people. And so we were really conscious of the tribes needed to control their own archival and oral history information and to be recognized as individuals and experts and intellectuals in their own rights. So next slide. So we had to actually get, because this was a research project, an IRB from UCSC. That follows the standard Western sort of procedures, but we also, as Alexi was pointing out this morning, sort of followed the tribal procedures as well. And so it's really important that we made sure that we broke down the sort of colonial practices of research and really worked with the tribe. And one sort of example of that is that one of the researchers from the Amamutsun tribal band went into the J.P. Harrington papers and he picked out the 58 pages that had to do with missions that we looked at as we were doing our work. But we didn't have access to all the papers because some of them contained sacred information. And so we respected that and we used what we were given, but we didn't, try to go beyond that. Next slide. And then just to make sure that we were always in constant communication with Chair Lopez and that we were following the wishes, we understood that if we didn't follow the Amamutsun tribal band protocols, there was a possibility of making some really big mistakes. And not doing that, we might not have been historically accurate, or we might have caused damage to this relationship. So we were always very conscious of not causing damage to this relationship that had been built up over time. So next slide, please. A key phrase, and one that just occurs over and over again, is nothing about us without us, right? And like Carolyn said, the land acknowledgement is great, but it's just a first step. It's sort of, we need to have those other relationships and those other ways that we interact with the tribal members to really help them fulfill their wishes and do what needs to be done. Next slide, please. So, understanding that there are different goals and histories and perspectives and rules of engagement can help you see where some conflict between different groups might occur, as well as it can provide a roadmap for what's going to be most valuable within a collaboration. And these communities have different ways of being in the world, and the work happens productively in the boundaries between those ways of being. But it's particularly important to recognize that there has been historical trauma with settler colonialism that sort of shades indigenous communities and may affect the way that indigenous communities want to interact with different groups. Next slide, please. So on a very practical level, I think it's very important to have an advisory committee that can facilitate this work in the boundaries, and to have these sort of agreements that Alexi talked about, the MOUs, or the easements, that kind of an idea, because it could sort of increase the Amamutsun tribal band's ability to be stewards of the land. And it also shows that there's a relationship that is codified within the realms of the university or within the realms of whatever organization you're in. And that is important because sometimes administrators change. Sometimes people change. And so if you have that sort of codified, it gives you a place to go back to and say, well, we talked about this. Let's, revisit this agreement. And it might not be legally binding, but at least it shows that there was an intent. And I think that's really important. Next slide, please. It's also respectful and important to provide compensation for the people who are coming to you. As tribal representatives, teachers, researchers, interviewers, or whoever. The idea of breaking bread together or having lunch together is fantastic because it really allows people to get together and talk in a really informal way and come together as a community. And then also, I think it's important just to realize that people's time is limited. And so one of the things that we tried to do was to make some videos of the elders that teachers could show in their classrooms, because there aren't that many people in the Amamutsun tribal band and not that many that can go out to schools. And Val is pushed to the limits. And so trying to make it easier for anyone to work with your community is worthwhile. Next slide. So the worldviews of Western and indigenous cultures can be very different in terms of the conceptions of time, epistemology, human relationships, and nature. And I just want to point out, I was doing a research project with a friend, and we were at a weekend retreat for this research group, and they were late serving breakfast. And so some of us were stuck eating breakfast, and we went beyond the time that was on the agenda for the start of the meeting. And so when we got back to the room, my colleague had already started the meeting. And I was horrified because my sense was that we would wait to gather. We were building community, we would gather, we would start when everybody was there. But her sense from a Western perspective was that the start time on the agenda was sacrosanct, and that it was important to follow that because it was written down on the agenda. So I think that those kinds of things sometimes get in the way of productive collaborations. Lack of consultation with Native communities can be seen as profound disrespect, and it reeks of colonial habits. And oftentimes people mean well, but they'll do things like hire somebody or, create something, on behalf of the indigenous community without talking to the indigenous community. And that's problematic, as you can well imagine. And then as academics, we are in a publish-or-perish world, and so it's expedient to just write a paper and send it off, because that's what you're supposed to do. But if you don't go back and talk to the tribal members and get approval for every single piece, it's expedient, but it's not respectful. And it's not going to engender the kind of trust that you need for a successful collaboration. So, next slide. So, I'm going to change gears now. Daisy talked about some of the curriculum we created, and that's sort of a big thing. As I was part of this project, I was teaching a multicultural children's literature class. And next slide. In 2018, we were looking at the diversity in children's books. And it turns out that 1% or less than 1% of the books that were published in 2018 were either written for or about, by or about Indigenous populations. Okay? That's pretty bad. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is last year. It's doubled. That's the good news. We're 2% now. However, that's still pretty dismal. So I decided to write a fictional picture book based on the time that the missionaries and the Spaniards, the missionaries came and the Spaniards first arrived. It's an imagined tale. It's not a traditional legend or a story. But I've used Amamutsan words as the names for the animals and for the Spaniards. And I've also included historically accurate endnotes so that students and their parents or their teachers can go back to that in a section called Think About It, Talk About It, and actually look at what we know about what was happening at the time. So I think that this is a PowerPoint that you're going to be able to show. Oh, next slide. Next, yeah, there we go. So, next slide. Okay. So this book is dedicated to the Awaswas and Amamutsan people who inhabited the northern region of the Monterey Bay for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. It's also dedicated to the educators who strive to bring an Indigenous perspective about the missions to their students. Okay, next. Tong, tong, tong. Mission Santa Cruz tested the new bells that hung above the white building. Tong, tong, tong. The mission priests and other Moonish liked the loud sound. Tong, tong, tong. The bells were brought by ship to the Monterey Bay and hauled up the hill to the mission in a horse-drawn cart. Now the priests could regulate the time and schedule of everyone living in and around the mission, including the Amamutsan people who were held as captives. Tong, tong, tong. The ringing echoed around the bay, disturbing the animals and the people. Oros erupted from his cozy bed of tree limbs and hit his head on the top of the cave. Arrgh! He shouted, "Who dares to awaken me from my peaceful sleep?" Tamala sprung from her cave, ready to fight the noisy intruder. "Who dares to make such a racket? Where are you?" Suri leapt from his nest high up in the pines and soared over the marshes and the meadows. He searched for the enemy who made such an ear-splitting sound. Rinya ran as fast as she could to the safety of her den and her mother. As they huddled together shaking, she thought, "It must be some kind of monster. Maybe it has fangs and has come to eat us all." Sakat slowly popped his head out of the ground and grumbled, "What now?" Everyone could hear the sound of the bells for miles and miles. Tong, tong, tong. The bells rang out when the sun rose, when the sun was highest in the sky, and when the sun set. Every single day. It was constant clanging that upset the peaceful valley and made it hard to concentrate. One day, Oris had enough. He called the council of animals together. "We have to make this stop," he said. "I want to sleep." All the animals agreed, but what could they do? They had discovered that the sound came when the priest pulled the bell's ropes. Humunya told the others, "I tried to urge the priests to stop the noise by speaking to them while they sleep, but they don't listen. The Amamutsan people always hear me when I send them dream messages. Perhaps we can send a message to the priests through the Amamutsan people," suggested Ashit. "I tried that too," Amunya sighed. "They said that the bells rule their lives at the mission, when to get up, when to eat, when to work, and when to come back from the fields. They have to obey or be punished." "Well, I'm tired of it," grumbled Oris. "I'm going down there myself. Maybe they'll pay attention if they know everybody hates the sound." So Oris rumbled towards the large white building. When he got close, the Mudish jumped up and shouted. They rang the bells louder and louder. Instead of listening to Oris, they pulled out their rat-a-tats and started firing. Bang, bang, whiz. Oris yelped as a bullet grazed his shoulder. The pain was worse than 500 bee stings. Shuyu packed Oris's wings with herbs and kelp to help it heal. The animals tried to think of another way to stop the clanging bells. "I know," said Asuyan. "What if we build nests inside of them? That would stop the clappers from making such a racket." The animals agreed it was worth a try. Assuran and her sisters gathered reeds, roots, grasses, and soft feathers. Unfortunately, there was no way to anchor the nests inside the smooth, curved metal. The reeds, roots, grasses, and feathers rained down on the Munish. Tong, tong, tong. Discouraged, the sparrows returned to the council. Again, the animals thought and thought. Finally, Renya said, "I know I'm small, but I'm persistent. I'm going to gnaw the ropes that the priests pull." None of the other animals could come up with a better idea, so Renya scampered to the mission and climbed high into the bell tower. For 7 days and 7 nights, she gnawed. Finally, with one last bite, the rope slid down to the ground. There was no way to ring the bells that morning. The animals cheered the peaceful silence. The only sounds they heard were the ocean and the wind blowing through the trees. They rejoiced, congratulated Renya, and went home. But the priests found old clothes and blankets and tore them into strips. They wove together makeshift poles until new ropes arrived from Mexico. One of the younger priests climbed up and attached them. The next week, Renya and her sisters gnawed through those stand-in ropes. The priests made the Amamutsan women weave new ropes, but they hated the bells as much as the animals did, so they created weak spots as they wove. Every time a new rope pole was attached, another mouse started gnawing. This continued for many, many years. It didn't completely stop the bells, but each delay felt like a small victory. Then one day, the earth rumbled and shook so violently that the entire bell tower toppled to the ground. It was never replaced. The bells were no more. By then, though, more Munish and other people had arrived in the valley. The sounds of the blacksmith shops, gunfire, awful music, and other new sounds were constant. Then a train whistle blew. Woo! Sakat slowly popped his head out of the ground and grumbled, "What now?" So this is the think about it, talk about it part. It talks a little bit about the Amamutsan people. And then the next slide It talks about how they lived before the Spanish came, what they ate, and how they managed the lands. Next slide. And then these are the names of the animals that I put in the book. There's actually a Mutsun English dictionary has been created over several years, but in 2016 it was published. So that's great. And all the animals live in this area except bears. We don't have any bears anymore. And then the next slide is about the impact of the missions. And it's actually true that there was an earthquake, and it destroyed the mission in 1840, and the bell tower fell down. And then the first train arrived in 1874. So, and then if you go to the next one, this is just more information, and it has some of the academic documents you can refer back to for some of the things we talked about. And then the last slide, you can scan this, and if you scan this other side, you can get to the free curriculum and resources from our Critical Missions project, which goes to Daisy's website. So, all right.
I want to just thank all of you panelists so much for the extraordinary commitment for developing all this material over time, seeing how that continues in the future, and we totally appreciate it. Thank you so much from everybody here. Thank you. We are running over, and if people will expand our listening just a little bit more, we have time for a question answer period and then a very short wrapping up of what's next and a closing. So we have a few questions. If people have questions from what we've just listened to, please raise your hands. If you need paper and pens, and Dora and Liz will come down. And we'll get started with a couple of questions in the meantime, and then we can. Yeah? Yeah, can you put the QR code back on for people to take a picture of? The last, I think it's the last slide. Exactly. Yeah. Beautiful. And while we're getting the first question, I just want to say we have the pleasure of a small art exhibit, a couple of paintings that were done, delivered today, right outside here as people leave, from Nathan Vasquez. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So people can take a look at that, and please, check the table and the book that's available from today, and also, if people like, there will be refreshments in the community room and a little time to debrief if people would like to chat after we're over today. Okay? So with that, if we're ready for the first question? Okay, super. Thank you all.
What is the first guideline or advice you would give anybody teaching Indigenous history, culture, realities, or Indigenous knowledge? And what do you think is the best way to support curriculum development in public schools?
Okay, I'm going to start just by saying, wherever you're at, contact the local tribal members in that area, because there are 110 California Indian tribes, and they're, each region has their own community, and some of the communities are more active than others, but definitely reach out to the local Indigenous community.
And if you Google native land, you will get a map that notice the disclaimer. It is very different from what we expect in the West regarding maps, but then you can find websites for the folks who are in your region. It connects to the websites of the local Indigenous folks. I would just say, and first go read what's there. You know, do the homework. See what they've already put out. And then I would just, like, there are an early story during the pandemic when we started with working with some undergrads, and it was like, well, there's the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian, right? And they've got like this guideline about how to teach. And I brought it to Judy and Renya, and they were like, oh, no, 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 no. And so, which was really useful, right? And so then we found some other things that are just sort of like, there's one thing that we did like was from Illuminative, which they have like do's and don'ts. And some of them you go, well, of course, but teachers have looked at that. They're very concrete kinds of things, like, you know, we're in the week, right? We're like, don't dress up and play Thanksgiving. So some of them seem obvious, but they're like concrete do's and don'ts. It's on a one-page thing. Which I think is helpful. And then, and there are some other, there's the California Museum of the Indian, who also has like 6 principles. So there's some frameworks out there that are helpful, but like in terms of changing the curriculum, that was the second part of the question? Yeah, I mean, you know, that's...
You're just support, yeah.
Multiple levers are needed.
Yeah, and I think visiting the History of Civic Project website, because we've already, gathered a lot of resources, and it's on the website too.
Thank you. This question's for 3 years. I've got 2 questions, and then I think we need to wrap it up. But for 3 years, Cabrillo College worked towards changing the name from a conquistador to something that recognized the Native American history. After 3 years, they decided to move the deadline to 2028 because it received numerous resistance efforts from the community. What should we do?
We started this work more than 3 years ago, and we had this all came up at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had like, let's have the K-12 students in this area get involved in this, and with an inquiry question like, what's in a name? What does it mean? I don't know what we should do, but I will speak just to my own dismay and sadness about the discourse that surrounded that in this community. And it shows that there's a lot of work to be done. I think that and the difference between, and here I speak from my disciplinary position, but there is a difference between history, if we think of history as a place where we're trying to tell accurate and as complete a story as possible, and memory, and what we decide to memorialize and commemorate. And that does show something about what we value today. It doesn't show anything about what happened in the 16th century. It shows what we value and what we care about and what we want to lift up. And I feel like that distinction was missing, as it has been nationwide. So I don't know what to do, but boy, was that discouraging, to use a lighter word than...
Well, and it echoes of all of the different efforts to try to change mascots across the U.S., right? They're still doing the chop, 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 and they're still doing, the Illini war dance. It's discouraging is not the right word. I mean, it should be far beyond that. And it's hard because I think people need to get educated about how hurtful those sorts of things are. And I think that is a long and hard process.
When a name becomes more important than harm it's doing to a particular population, it's familiar, but we continue to be in trouble.
And then I think just our last question, I think it's this, do you know who owns the land where the missions are now?
Well, there's lots of different missions, right?
Right.
So some
I
of
think
them.
it's probably Santa Cruz mission.
So the Santa Cruz mission is partly part of the state park, and so it's owned by the state. But also next to it is the Catholic Church. The Holy Cross Church. So that's owned by the Catholic Church, and so I think that happens sort of. A lot of the land that is still where missions are throughout California are owned by the Catholic Church. And
Okay, I think that's it for this panel. Thank you so much for everyone. A warm round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And maybe you'll be around to stay later or for questions, but I just want to begin to wrap up our time here together with, just want to thank all of the speakers for being here today, for trusting us, and for your time. You've really inspired us to act and to support. And we want, for many of you, you might be thinking about like what's next, how to engage. I know there was a lot of questions about ways to bridge this gap between, these issues. And there are a lot of people doing great work on every level. So these are just we put together a short list of things for you. So you can take photos of this to go to the websites. We've got tabling out there for the Ama Mutsun Land Trust, and to find out more about that. Some tribal members are still here to engage with them. Please engage, support in all of these different ways. And there's also things that aren't listed up here, right? So you might have been moved and to create something in your communities, with your circles, to have these dialogues and conversations with your families and communities and schools. If you have your cards or want to let us know what those are, or be in touch with us, or want support around something, write it on a card and leave it at one of the tables in the back, and we'll do our best to do that. There's also, this was a free event, right? There's a bunch of volunteer, grassroots people. Thank you for your patience with everything. And we, just a lot of love in room. So I acknowledge all the volunteers, and Liza, and the Resource Center for Nonviolence, the Ama Mutsun Tribal Band, of course, Joseph Schultz for that great lunch, for the rain to be gentle with us. That was really great. So Chairman Lopez reminds us how to work together and how to heal Mother Earth, to heal our relationship with her, to keep land sacred, to heal ourselves, and to heal our relationships and the land itself. I think our time together, we've taken some steps in this road. Thank you for being here. Take what you've learned back to your lives and multiply for our future together. Please stop by the tables outside for more information, to sign up. There's some sign-up sheets back there. We have the Friends of Huristock has newsletters. We have monthly meetings if you want to join the Friends of Huristock campaign, to stand in solidarity with the tribe and to groundswell protection of that sacred site and restore their traditional access. Thank you for coming. Safe travels home.